Yeah, just hello and welcome. Today we've got Sean Sexton with us, one of the founding partners of MSB Solicitors, and a practitioner with a specialist in crime, particularly regulatory crime. So welcome, Sean.
Thanks, Andrew.
Lovely to have you here as well. It's the first podcast for potentially a mini-series of ones relating to social housing. I'm particularly looking at social housing and regulatory crime today. So just a little about yourself then, Sean. What's your background in terms of your practice to date?
Yeah, I'm 35 years qualified, I suppose now. Background was in litigation. For the last 20 years, I've specialised in serious fraud and also regulatory health and safety work. So there are always large cases. There's always a lot at stake. And the penalties on conviction or even on a guilty plea are always significant.
Yeah, of course. It's certainly interesting as well from a social housing perspective. My background being in social housing and specialising in that compliance sector of social housing as well. It's something that it's not something that happens every day, is it? But when it does happen, it tends to be quite serious. The implications are serious and the consequences can be very serious.
It can be catastrophic.
Indeed. And obviously the offences as well in terms of the potential punishments can be catastrophic as well, can't they?
Particularly say with health and safety, where in February 2018, the government, the Sentencing Council introduced new guidelines for health and safety offences. In the past, it was very much, a judge would listen to the case, listen to the facts, sort of put his finger in the air and sort of come up with whatever felt to be the appropriate financial penalty.
Yes, of course.
But what that meant was that, one, there was no consistency in sentencing. And also very often, very large organizations will find what really were trifling amounts in terms of their profits or turnover. Companies being fined £20,000 when an employee has died in a fatal accident at work. There needed to be something that made sure that people took their responsibilities as senior managers and directors seriously.
Yeah,
so these new sentencing guidelines came in, and they really are tough, and
they're across the board as well, aren't they? There's no escaping them, really, is there? Realistically,
no, and they're designed to actually make companies think about how they operate and whether the policies and procedures they've got are up to fit for purpose.
Just to pick you up on that point, you mentioned policies and procedures there specifically, and I think that's really an important thing, isn't it? Because it's about, from our perspective, I know the work you've done is obviously reactionary because you would ordinarily be instructed once there's been a breach in relation to that. And useful to get you here today because contrary to that, my work would be to do it proactively and be advised on that. The policy and procedure point you talked about, I'd suggest that's probably one of the most important things in avoiding it, isn't it? As much as anything, avoiding being in breach of these regulations.
Yeah, the important thing is to consider the risks in what you do. And too often, firms, even very large firms or organizations, just bring in, say, for example, in the realm of health and safety, they bring in policies and procedures which are generic. They've been adapted for sort of one-size-fits-all companies, and they're just not appropriate to the specific workplace or area of work in which that company operates. And that causes major problems because if you simply have generic risk assessments, it means you haven't fully considered the risk to your employees or the public in the work that you're doing. And now, if you fall in breach of that, essentially the financial penalties alone are measured, or the starting point for those financial penalties is based on your turnover, not on your profit, on your turnover. So, if you have a turnover of 10, 20, 50 million pounds, you're at risk of fines that could be, in the range of, £500,000 to £2 million.
Particularly for social housing, you referenced there, not risk assessing to the public as well. That's something I think that's quite important in terms of the social housing sector. Obviously, they've got a huge responsibility to their own tenants, but also to the wider public and wider community, being something of a sort of quasi-public body, as it were. They've got that social responsibility that they need to take care of, don't they, as well?
They do, and part of the problem is that people too often fall into we've always done it this way, so it must be okay, or everyone else does it this way, so it's okay.
It's something that needs to be looked at constantly, doesn't it, and reviewed and reiterated.
Because until something happens, no one changes their procedures. You actually got to look at your organization, assess what the risks are, and actually come up with policies that are appropriate to that. And too often, even very large companies fail to do that. And it's only then when you get into a situation where there's an investigation following a fatal accident, for example, that suddenly the focus becomes on your company and on your senior managers.
Of course. Yeah. And those policies then are the spotlight's shone on them, isn't it? And what you have or haven't done is particularly looked at, isn't it?
It's not just the company or the organization that is at risk. It's the senior managers and directors personally.
So who would you suggest is at risk mostly then? In terms of those particular personnel as you've referenced?
Well, it's whoever's responsible in the organization, for example, for health and safety or for that particular issue. And if, in fact, the failing of the organization is so grievous that it's something that would be regarded as being grossly negligent, then that individual senior manager or director can be prosecuted for gross negligence manslaughter.
I think it's particularly important in social housing that as well, where you've got this, as I've referenced before, sort of quasi-public body. It's really a bad look, isn't it? Because it's potentially a sort of extension of the state to some extent, isn't it? And if you've got individuals that are sort of pointing the finger and things for errors that have gone wrong, you want them to look internally, don't you, realistically or preferably, to avoid these things ever happening.
Again, and that's right. And the threat of, or even the instigation of, say, a gross negligence manslaughter prosecution, and the company also being charged, say, with health and safety offences, that often creates a situation where actually for the individual to avoid sanction, the company ends up having to plead guilty, and that presents risks for the company.
Of course.
So,
yeah.
as you were saying, the important thing actually is to start thinking about this before you ever get into that kind of situation. And if you can show that you did your best to appreciate the specific areas that have caused whatever the issue is, then you can say that you've taken reasonable steps to protect your employees and to protect the public.
And that's the key phrase, isn't it? It's reasonable steps. And with all those risk assessments, with all those policies and procedures, everything's got to be geared up to that, doesn't it? What reasonable steps in order to be proactive and elicit any defence if anything did happen? You can say, well, we have taken X, Y, and Z, and we've done that, and our policy highlights that, doesn't it?
It does, and that's crucial. The other thing, though, is you need to actually be looking and keeping up to date with changes in regulations, changes in guidance, and that's something you can't just sort of delegate to maybe an outside consultant. Well, you can, but that presents risks in itself. It's important you take advice from people who know what they're doing, are actually going to alert you proactively to what needs to be done to protect the organisation. It's
an interesting point that you've raised there, actually, in terms of keeping up to date with regulations and legislation that's coming in. And I think it's important at the moment in social housing, and you've referenced there, there's new sentencing guidelines came in not that long ago. Going forward, it seems to me, that's just another piece of evidence towards we're moving into an ever more compliance-based world. Social housing have got numerous potential new legislations coming in terms of the fire safety bill, the building safety bill. You've had consultations recently on smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms going into properties, all of which create an extra body of regulation, don't they? Or extra body of compliance that needs to be looked at, and needs to be looked at sooner rather than later, doesn't it?
Yes, and too often as well, organizations think that if they adopt a tick box mentality towards regulatory compliance, then that will be okay. But it isn't. There are common misconceptions in different industries. For example, in the construction industry, it was commonly believed that say if you had a gas installation, that anyone could do it, provided it was then inspected. The work was inspected after it had been done by somebody who's gas safe registered. Well, no, the regulations require the person or company undertaking that work is gas safe registered. You can't rely on sort of what you perceive to be the traditional practice in your area. You've got to make those judgments yourself, and you've got to show that you did it, and that you didn't just buy in some generic policy, that you actually looked specifically at what you as an organization need to be doing. And if you can do that, then you can sleep at night.
Of course, absolutely. It's an interesting point that you've raised as well, that the gas leak that you referenced didn't happen for another 3 years. It wasn't even that there was a breach at the time.
Yeah.
The incident that led to the breach being highlighted is 3 years down the line.
That's right.
So there's significant, and it just brings back, doesn't it, to the point we've kind of touched on previously about having that in place prior to it, because it isn't something that's going to become highlighted whilst the job's being done or whilst you're ticking that box. It's going to be later, isn't it?
Yeah, and issues as simple as the documentation that related to that contract had been shredded, and they hadn't kept it. So even if they had been compliant, they would have had difficulty in documenting their compliance.
Yeah, of course, absolutely, absolutely. And I think in social housing, that documentary evidence is crucial, in particular because there's so many things across the board. Particularly social housing providers manage so many properties with so many different tenants, and ensuring that all of those things are up to standard, from whether it be fresh new building works they're carrying out or just maintaining housing management going forward as well. The levels of compliance are consistent across the board, aren't they?
Yes, and this isn't going to get any easier. We are only going to have more and more regulatory burden, and if organisations don't anticipate what's coming down the line, then they need to start doing it now,
Yeah.
because it's these are very serious risks to the integrity of companies.
Of course, that's brilliant. I think it brings us to the end of our session for today. It's been really nice to have you on. Lovely to see you as
Andrew,
well. So,
yeah, great to chat.
thanks very much. So if anyone does want any further information on social housing issues and compliance, feel free to get in touch with myself, Andrew Fairman of MSB, and many thanks to Sean Sexton for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.